There are two sentences on a blackboard in Pasadena written by a dying man, and together they make God mathematically impossible. I'm not going to argue with you about theology. I'm not interested in Scripture. I'm not interested in the personal testimony of people who felt something one Sunday morning and decided that settled it. I'm interested in mathematics because here's the thing about mathematics. You can't negotiate with it. You can't pray to it. You can't tell it that your grandfather was a good man, and therefore the equation should come out differently. Mathematics doesn't care. And what I want to show you tonight, what I want to lay out in front of you piece by piece, the way you dissect a frog, is that the concept of a God who intervenes, who designs, who knows, who acts, that concept doesn't just collide with physics, it collides with math, and math doesn't blink. By the end of this, you're going to understand why a blackboard at Caltech, two sentences written by a man who knew he was dying, contains quietly the most devastating argument against the divine that has ever been written, not because he intended it that way, because the truth doesn't ask your permission. Now, look, I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. This is not an argument about whether God exists in some vague cosmic sense. I've always found that conversation a little like arguing about whether unicorns prefer apples or sugar cubes. Interesting maybe, but specific about what exactly what I'm asking is a sharper question. What would it mean for a God to be real? Not real the way I feel warm when I drink coffee, real the way the electron is real, something with properties, with constraints, with an address in the equations of physics. Because if God has no properties, if God is entirely beyond description, beyond physics, beyond logic, then great, fine. We have nothing to argue about. That God is just a word you've chosen to point at the mystery of existence. I have a different word for that. I call it the universe. We probably agree. But the moment you say God does something, heals, designs, listens, intervenes, answers prayers, chose the laws of nature, the moment God acts, that God has entered the jurisdiction of physics. And in physics, every claim is a check made out to the universe, and the universe will cash it. So, let's cash some checks. It's January 1988. Richard Feynman, and I'm using the third person here just for a second. It feels right. Richard Feynman is 69 years old. He has kidney cancer. He has had 2 surgeries. He knows roughly that there isn't much road left. And he goes to his blackboard at Caltech and he writes 2 things. What I cannot create, I do not understand. And below that know how to solve every problem that has been solved. He dies 6 weeks later. Now, most people who tell that story treat it as inspiration, as a kind of Feynman wallpaper, a poster for physics classrooms. You should understand deeply, very nice, but I think they're missing it. I think those 2 sentences are a specific technical epistemo-logical argument. They're saying understanding is not the same as recognition. Understanding is not the same as feeling. Understanding is not the same as being told. Understanding is the ability to build it yourself. You don't understand a bridge by looking at a bridge. You understand a bridge when you know enough engineering to build one, and when the bridge you build stands up. Now, here's the question, can you build God? I don't mean the religious experience. I don't mean the sense of meaning, the comfort at a funeral, the feeling that something is watching. Those are real things that happen to people, and I'm not going to be dismissive about them. I mean, can you derive God? Can you start from the equations and show the way you'd show a derivation in physics, that a designing, intervening, all-knowing entity is a necessary consequence of what we observe? Because if you can't, then on that blackboard, without meaning to, Feynman wrote the question that breaks it. What I cannot create, I do not understand. Here's something almost nobody knows about physics. Conservation of energy, the thing every textbook treats like bedrock, like an obvious fact, isn't an axiom. It's not something we assumed and then looked for evidence of. It's a consequence, a mathematical consequence of symmetry. In 1915, a German mathematician named Emmy Noether proved a theorem so important that Einstein called her the most significant creative mathematical genius yet produced. And she proved it the same year Einstein finished general relativity. So, the competition was stiff. The theorem says this: for every continuous symmetry in the laws of physics, there is a corresponding conservation law. The laws of physics look the same today as they did yesterday. That's a symmetry, time translation symmetry, and it gives you conservation of energy. The laws of physics are the same here as they are in Tokyo. Spatial symmetry, conservation of momentum, same in every direction. Rotational symmetry, conservation of angular momentum, symmetry in, conservation law out every time like clockwork. Now, here's where God walks into the room. Miracle, by definition, is an event in which the laws of physics are suspended. Water turns to wine, a dead man gets up and walks. 5 loaves of bread feed 5 zero people. What's happening physically in a miracle? Energy is appearing from nowhere, or being redirected, or information is being injected into a closed system from outside. But Noether's theorem says conservation of energy is not an empirical regularity. It is a mathematical consequence of the fact that the laws of physics are the same today as yesterday. If you violate conservation of energy, if you perform a miracle, you are not just breaking a rule. You are breaking the symmetry of time. And that's not a small thing. You know what it's like. Imagine you're playing chess and someone moves the bishop sideways. And you say, wait, bishops move diagonally. That's the rule. And they say, yes, but for this special move, the bishop went sideways. And you say, okay, but if the bishop can go sideways, then it's not a bishop anymore. The word has no meaning. The game has no structure. That's what a miracle does to physics. It doesn't bend the rules. It makes the rules unintelligible. Because here's the thing people miss about conservation laws. They're not the kind of laws you can suspend selectively. They're structural, they're load-bearing walls. You pull one out and the whole house comes down. You want to heal someone miraculously. That requires energy appearing in a system from outside the system. But if energy can appear from outside from divine will, then the symmetry of time is broken. And if the symmetry of time is broken, then conservation of energy is gone. Not for the miracle everywhere permanently, because the symmetry either holds or it doesn't. God, as a miracle worker, doesn't just challenge physics. God's intervention makes consistent physics impossible. And I realize I've been talking fast. Let me slow down and say that again more simply. Miracles aren't just unlikely. They require the universe to stop being mathematically coherent while the miracle happens. Emmy Noether proved that in 1915. Nobody's found a hole in the argument since. But wait, that was the easy one. Wait until you see what the number 1 over 137 requires. Here's a number that kept me up at night for years. 1 over 137, or more precisely, 0. 729,735,256. It's called the fine structure constant, the letter alpha. Alpha, it's the number that tells you how strongly an electron couples to the electromagnetic field, how tightly light and matter interact. It determines the brightness of the sun, the chemistry of DNA, the fact that your hand doesn't pass through the desk. And here's what's strange about it. It's dimensionless. That means it's not 1 over 137 m or 1 over 137 seconds or 1 over 137 anything. It's just 1 over 137, a pure number. It doesn't depend on what it's you use. A physicist in Tokyo and a physicist on Mars will measure the same number. It's one of the most precisely measured constants in physics. The theory and experiment agree to 10 decimal places. 10 decimal places. That's like measuring the distance from New York to Los Angeles and getting it right to the width of a human hair. Now, here's my question. If God designed the universe, if there was an intelligence that chose the laws of nature, chose the constants, set everything up, what equation did God solve to arrive at 1 over 137? I asked this question at a dinner party once in Pasadena, and a theologian said to me, God is beyond equations. God chose 1 over 137 freely by divine will. And I said, okay, let me think about that. If God chose 1 over 137 freely, meaning God could have chosen 1 over 136 or 1 over 200 or 7 without any mathematical reason, then the universe isn't designed. It's arbitrary. God rolled dice. The universe has no underlying necessity. Everything could have been completely different for no reason. That's not a designed universe. That's a random one. But maybe the theologian means something different. Maybe they mean God chose 1 over 137 necessarily because it had to be 1 over 137 for the universe to support complexity. Life-conscious beings who can ask the question. That's the fine-tuning argument, and it sounds persuasive until you realize what it actually says. It says mathematics constrained God. God couldn't have chosen 1 over 200 because that wouldn't have worked. So there was a constraint prior to God's choice, a mathematical structure that God had to navigate, had to satisfy, had to fit inside. And if mathematics is more fundamental than God, then mathematics is the real God. I've thought about this for a long time. And both exits from this room lead to the same place. Either the constants are arbitrary and God's design is indistinguishable from random chance, or the constants are necessary and mathematics, not God, is the true foundation. Alpha Alvaria 1 over 137 isn't an argument for God. It's an argument for mathematics, and there's more. Because once you understand that the constants might not be free parameters at all, that they might be mathematically inevitable, derived from some deeper structure we haven't found yet, you realize something unsettling. What's left for God to have done? But that question gets sharper, a lot sharper when you meet the equation with no time variable. I want to tell you about the most disturbing equation in physics. Not disturbing because it's complicated. Disturbing because of what it's missing. In 1967, Bryce Ditt, following ideas from John Wheeler, who was one of the great physical thinkers of the 20th century, wrote down what was supposed to be the quantum theory of gravity, the equation that describes the entire universe as a quantum mechanical object. The equation is called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. And when you write it out, when you look at the left side and the right side and everything in between, there is no no time variable in the fundamental equation that describes the quantum state of the whole universe. Time doesn't appear. This is not a typo. It's not an approximation. It's a deep structural feature of what happens when you try to combine quantum mechanics with general relativity. At the most fundamental level, time as a basic variable disappears. I know how this sounds. I felt the same way the first time. But time obviously exists. I watched my coffee get cold this morning. Yes, and that's real. Your coffee got cold. Time is real in the same way that temperature is real. It's an emergent property. It's what you get when you have many, many particles interacting with each other in a particular way. Temperature isn't a fundamental property of a single atom. Neither, it turns out, is time a fundamental feature of the universe. Time is something that emerges from entanglement, from entropy, from the coarse graining of a quantum state that had no time to begin with. Now, think about what this means for God. Every conception of God I've ever encountered involves time in an essential way. God existed before the universe. God acts in history. God knows the future. God listens to prayers now and answers them later. All of that, every preposition, every tense requires time. But the Wheeler-Ditt equation says at the fundamental level, there is no before. There is no God existed before and then created. That temporal structure is not in the equations. It's something that emerges much later for complicated collections of particles like us. A God who acts in time has no mathematical floor to stand on. And here's the thing that really bothers me. I've seen people respond to this by saying, well, God is outside time. God is atemporal. Fine. Let's say God is outside time. Let's say God exists in some eternal structure that contains no before or after. Then how does this atemporal God cause specific things to happen at specific moments? How does an entity with no time relationship to the universe cause the Red Sea to part on the Tuesday? How does it answer a prayer sent at 9 in the morning and cause a remission that the oncologist notices at 2 in the afternoon? If God is outside time, God cannot intervene in time. The intervention is itself a temporal event. You can't have it both ways. Either God is inside time, and the Wheeler-Ditt equation says there's no fundamental floor for that, or God is outside time, and intervention becomes logically incoherent. This is the trap, and most theology never examines it. They just step over it quietly, but the equation is still there. And the equation doesn't step over anything. But here's what I find most interesting, not the trap. The escape attempt, because there is one last argument. The designer got people fall back on the numbers. The incredibly, almost suspiciously precise numbers. And when I show you what those numbers actually say, let me tell you about the worst prediction in the history of physics. And I want to stress I am proud of physics. I love physics. Physics is the most successful attempt by human beings to describe reality that has ever existed. Quantum electrodynamics agrees with experiment to 10 decimal places. That's insane. That's like predicting the exact time the sun will rise 3 centuries from now. But then there's the cosmological constant, the cosmological constant. The term Einstein added to his equations, and then called his greatest blunder, represents the energy density of empty space. The vacuum and quantum field theory makes a prediction for this number. The prediction is wrong by a factor of 10 to the power of 120. Let me make sure that lands not wrong by a factor of 2, not wrong by a factor of 1,000,000, wrong by a factor of 10, followed by 120 zeros. It is the largest discrepancy between theory and experiment in the history of science. Okay, so either quantum field theory is deeply wrong about something, and it isn't. We've checked it 15 different ways, or something is canceling this enormous vacuum energy almost perfectly, tuning it down from 10 to the power of 120 to essentially 0 with a precision that makes a Swiss watch look like a rock. And this is where people who believe in a designing God reach for this number and say, see, that's God's fine-tuning. Only a designer could cancel that with such precision. But here's what I think when I hear that a watchmaker who produces a watch that is wrong by a factor of 10 to the power of 120 and then corrects it at the last moment isn't a brilliant designer. That's a designer who made a catastrophically wrong calculation and then patched it. If I handed in that calculation to a professor, I would not receive credit for getting the right answer at the end. I would have points taken off for the wrong intermediate step. The cosmological constant problem isn't evidence for fine-tuning. It's evidence that we don't understand what empty space is, that our equations are missing something enormous, that the vacuum is doing something we haven't found yet. Maybe the answer is beautiful. Maybe there's a symmetry that cancels the terms naturally. Maybe something stranger, but God corrected the math, is not a better answer than we don't know yet. We don't know yet is the most exciting sentence in physics. God did it is the most boring. But all of this neurother, the fine structure constant real ear, dwit the cosmological constant all of it, is pointing at something I think is the real answer. The thing on the blackboard, and I want to take you back there now. What I cannot create, I do not understand. I've been thinking about those words for 35 years. Let me tell you what I think they actually mean. What Feynman was getting at when he wrote them. Understanding is generative, that's the point. To really understand something, not to recognize it, not to have a strong feeling about it, not to have a strong feeling about it. To truly understand it means being able to generate it from first principles, from scratch, with nothing but your mind and the basic rules. When you understand Maxwell's equations, you can derive them. You can show where each term comes from. You can build the whole electromagnetic theory from the ground up. When you understand Newton's gravity, you can derive the orbit of the planets. You don't need to be told what the answer is. You can generate it. Now ask the question, does God understand the universe? In the religious view, yes, God understands everything. God knows every atom, every thought, every possible outcome. But here's what that criterion says. To understand a thing is to be able to build it. So God, who supposedly understands the universe, built it. But what did God use? What materials? What equations? What were the laws before the laws of physics existed? If God chose the laws, what logic did God use to evaluate which laws were better? Whatever that logic was, whatever structure God used to make the choice, that structure is more fundamental than God. That's the real ground, and here's the quiet thing I've always found in this argument. The more deeply you understand the universe, the less room there is for anything outside the understanding. Not because the universe is simple. It isn't. It's unimaginably beautifully complex. But because understanding means finding the structure, and the structure doesn't have an empty space in it, labeled God goes here. Every time we thought that space was there when we didn't understand disease, when we didn't understand lightning, when we didn't understand how species came to be, we put God there, and then we understood it, and the space closed. It was a method, and the method says keep going, keep building, keep deriving, and if you can't build it yet, say so honestly without filling the gap with something that sounds like an answer, but isn't, because I don't know is a real thing. God did it is a name for the not knowing, and those two things are not the same. I want to close with something that might surprise you. I'm not asking you to stop finding the universe beautiful. I'm not asking you to stop feeling wonder when you look at the stars, or when your kid is born, or when you hear music that hits you somewhere you can't name. I felt all of those things. The wonder doesn't go away when you understand the physics. It gets bigger. Actually, a lot bigger, because the universe turns out to be more intricate, more strange, more precisely structured than any religion ever suggested. The real answer to how the universe works is weirder than any sacred text. Symmetry groups and Bert spaces and quantum fields that flicker in and out of existence. An equation with no time variable, a pure number, 1 over 137, that determines whether matter can exist at all, with no explanation yet known for why it has that value. That's not less astonishing than a man walking on water. That's more astonishing, but here's where I land. The things I've described tonight, Noether's theorem, the fine structure constant, the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, the cosmological constant, those aren't arguments that the universe is cold and mechanical and empty of meaning. They're arguments that the universe is deep, so deep that it doesn't need an author, so deep that no author we've ever imagined has been deep enough to have authored it. The blackboard at Caltech is still there. 2 sentences. What I cannot create, I do not understand. He didn't write, therefore, God doesn't exist. He wrote something harder, something that leaves more open. He wrote, keep building, because the universe is the most interesting thing there is. And as long as there's more to understand, the equation isn't finished.